NEPTUNE'S Reach by Gregory Feeley. This story was published in the mid-December 1986 issue of Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. NEPTUNE'S Reach. The first jolt woke Yaroslav a second before the lights went out. He opened his eyes wider at the sudden fall of darkness, which never happened on board, and wondered confusedly if his eyes were still shut and he dreaming. The second jolt was harder and threw him from his bunk, leaving him no time to raise his hands before the pull of 1.4 gravities slammed the bulkhead against his face. Yaroslav lay still a second, the shocking pain from his broken nose clamoring through the fading realms of sleep, when he heard the ventilator near his right ear sigh to a stop. The ringing silence brought Yaroslav unsteadily to his hands and knees, and as he knelt there, raising his head slowly to minimize the drag pulling like hooks on his nose, he felt the faint vibrations beneath his palms fade to stillness. Full engine failure, he thought. There would be no backup lights glowing dimly in the control room. The imperceptibly cooling air was even now ceasing to circulate, sifting into thermoclines as blood settles within a body. Panic reached Yaroslav through his pain, and he heaved himself with a sickening lurch to his feet. The life module was too small for Yaroslav to become lost, and he made his way down the short hall into the control room, brushing his fingertips along either wall. The porthole shone as a dim blue rectangle, too faint to illuminate any other feature in the room. Yaroslav edged around the console dominating the small space to approach the porthole, but recoiled from drawing too close, afraid that its surface would already be cold. Locating the controls by touch, Yaroslav attempted to activate the auxiliary electrical system. The squares remained lifeless beneath his fingertips, and flipping a toggle to close a circuit manually produced only a click in the darkness. How fast are we losing heat? He thought. And then, how fast are we losing buoyancy? Groping his way along the length of the room, Yaroslav closed his hands over the pressure helmet which hung on the wall above the floor hatch. He fitted it over his head, almost shrieking when the unseen rim brushed the tip of his nose. Securing the seal around his collar, Yaroslav leaned across the control board until the helmet touched a length of pipe running down the wall. "Douglas?" he said. "Doug, are you listening?" A third jolt threw him backward, and when the helmet struck the bulkhead, Yaroslav could hear it, a metallic shearing below deck, as though the vessel's undercarriage were being pulled away. Another blow rocked the cabin, and he began to slide across the floor, disoriented within the confines of the helmet and darkness. Yaroslav was yelling, the trapped sounds drowning out the rending of metal. When the clamor and motion ceased, he was wedged between swivel seat and console, the bulkhead canted beneath him like the list of a sinking ship. The porthole showed a deeper aquamarine, darker as the atmosphere of Neptune thickened. Yaroslav had reached the medical kit by unscrewing the cabinet panels and had stuffed both nostrils with gauze soaked in anesthetic. He would have considered a painkiller, save that he could not identify the contents of the vials. With the stillness following the last jolts, a lucid calm had come over him. The hollow reverberation when he struck the deck with his fist confirmed his suspicion. The Diogenes had lost much of its undercarriage, presumably in striking some surface feature that thrust up like an invisible Everest. Douglas, the power cells, and an unknowable amount of hardware were gone, and the changing color outside showed that the Diogenes was still descending. Yaroslav made his way out of the room slowly, careful not to trip on the floor hatch. He wondered what lay on the other side. The ceiling in the corridor was low enough for even Yaroslav to reach, and he found the ceiling hatch easily. Like everything else in the life module, it was not designed to function in a total power failure, but Yaroslav had helped assemble most of the interior compartments, and thought he could get the ceiling panels off if there were not a pressure differential on the other side. If there was, of course, he was dead anyway. An indeterminate time later, Yaroslav had the collar around the hatch off and the fastening pins exposed. His arms ached from being raised over his head in the high gravity, and the effort of maintaining his balance on the tilted floor was hurting his back. He stood to one side and, stretching as far as his reach would allow, found 2 pins on opposite sides of the hatch and pulled them out. The remaining pins snapped like tiny bones, and the hatch crashed to the floor as though fired from a cannon. Dust and fine debris rained through the hatch, and Yaroslav began coughing in the darkness. He pulled down the rope ladder and climbed through, into the specimen bay. It was colder here, and Yaroslav realized with a pang that he had been expecting heat to have risen from below. He thought of the open hatch, now spilling warmth, and grimaced. The specimen bay was totally dark, lacking whatever dim gleam must have reached the hallway from the control room. Yaroslav knew where there was light, however. Squeezing past the instrument casings, he found the hatch to the main gas tank, which he knew had a manual override. Unscrewing the plug was easy, since its angle on the sloping shell put gravity on his side, but its weight almost pulled him to the floor. Straightening painfully, Yaroslav saw faint light streaming through the hatch. The interior of the gas tank resembled the empty silos near the center of Centaur's axis, where Yaroslav and his friends used to play. Strips of pale lighting ran its length, coolly luminescent so as to avoid any possibility of a spark reaching the methane samples. Yaroslav dropped to the floor, his arms trembling. The light soothed him, and he lay a moment looking up at its lines converging overhead, imagining for a confused moment that he was back in the vast tanks that were kept for holding water in the event that Centaur's mass had to be shifted, free spaces where the gravity was always low. Rolling onto his side, Yaroslav pulled a number of tubes from his pocket and brought them before his face. There were stimulants, sedatives, and painkillers, both for continued functioning and immediate sleep. Yaroslav's cheeks and sinuses seemed to hurt from proximity to pain. He took one of the blue-capped vials and began twisting it open, and a great voice thundered out of the air above him. "Calling Diogenes. Unger, can you read me?" Yaroslav thrashed about on the tank's concave bottom until the pain in his face shocked him alert, and he lay listening to the voice, which was vibrating the metal beneath him. It was inhuman, like that of a machine, and seemed to originate where the lines converged into darkness at the top of the tank. Yaroslav could not escape the sound, which shook his skull when he touched his head to the floor, but when he raised his face, the acoustic distortions achieved balance, and clarity emerged. "Diogenes, this is base camp. Can you read me, Unger?" Yaroslav thought fretfully that base camp could not be communicating by conduction, as he had attempted with Doug, for the skyline was far too long to carry vibrations, and no cable accompanied it, as it was not just being paid out, but stretching. "If you cannot use radio, you have no way to reply. We will assume you can hear us." Yaroslav wondered how communication could proceed only one way, then abruptly he had it. The realization seemed to bring things together in his mind. Base camp was hitting the top of the tank with microwaves or a laser, causing the entire shell to ring like a tympanum. "We are noting decreased drag on the skyline and assume that you have fired your thrusters or jettisoned mass. If you are not stabilizing life support, please assign highest priority to sending a reply, however brief." The dimensions of this problem, smaller and technical, calmed Yaroslav slightly, and his mind's eye darted among the darkened rooms below. He suddenly rose to his knees and began feeling for the hatchway, and within minutes was back down in the bunk room. The air was noticeably cooler, but Yaroslav forced that from his mind. He pulled open the drawers beneath the bottom bunk and rifled their contents, producing at length a palm-sized plastic box. Unger insisted on the value of being able to record his thoughts or observations wherever he was, and was as certain to have brought a spare as he was to have had his work model with him in the observation bay. Yaroslav turned the device over in his hands and sought the button he had seen Unger use. A tiny display screen appeared in the darkness. Yaroslav depressed a stud, and the digital display began counting. He said, "Power out. Unger lost. Undercarriage evidently severely damaged. Life module intact, but losing heat. This will be only message. Pull me up." He clicked off and made his way into the control room. Adjusting the recorder's display to maximum brightness, he passed it low over the radio controls, allowing him to read their settings. Most were already set for transmission to base camp. Yaroslav opened the cartridge deck, which fortunately popped up manually, and inserted the spicule from the recorder. He touched the transmit button and left it. Yaroslav then pulled the pressure suit off the wall and fumbled with the power pack on its belt. Removing the console panels for the radio, he felt about within until he pulled out 2 wires, an act that would court electrocution were there any power in the system. Yaroslav worked for several moments with the suit in his lap, then moved carefully away and illuminated one section of exposed circuitry with the recorder. Holding his screwdriver by its plastic handle, Yaroslav nudged a wire against a coupling. There was a bang and a spray of sparks. Lights on the control board blinked once. Yaroslav stood and examined the displays on the board. They showed that his message had been dispatched by the power surge. Slowly, Yaroslav climbed back to the main tank. He found the drug vials bunched at the nadir of the tank's shallow bowl and sat looking them over as he awaited his reply. He decided that he could not sedate himself, though the temptation clamored through his pain, but would take several local anesthetics, along with a mild, long-acting stimulant. He would wait until he was in his bunk, tilted now almost to the angle of a crash couch, before administering the doses. The clangor, as the beam struck the top of the tank, like the clearing of an immense throat, rumbled around him as base camp got their echo back, confirming contact and fine-tuned in. "Base camp to Droshka. Projections allow no possibility of hoisting vessel without significant thrust. Full buoyancy potential insufficient to supplant thrust. Please use backup system to advise extent and nature of electrical failure." It was, as Yaroslav realized, a death sentence, or the acknowledgement that one had already been written out in terms more precise than any prose. Should Yaroslav indeed have no power with which to reply, he could not control even the tiny thrusters that projected from the sides of the sample tanks, and would continue to descend, gently but uncontrollably, through the depths of Neptune's atmosphere. Some time later, the Diogenes gave a final jolt, then settled almost gently to rest. Yaroslav had hit bottom. There was pain somewhere in the middle distance and a voiceless urging that he get up, but Yaroslav turned in an analgesic eddy, weighted by heavy gravity, yet gliding in the snowfall of his centaur childhood. The surface beneath him, unyielding and cold where it pressed hardest, suggested in its curve great spherical spaces, humid greenhouse modules nodding beneath shafts of light, public causeways that arched out of sight. In the early years, the public spaces thronged. and Yaroslav's days were spent with schoolmates and child-sized teaching robots with patient voices and display screens for heads. Excursions up-country toward the axial midpoint brought lower gravity and astonishing delights, but small children were kept near the living levels, where the gravity was as great as Newell's, almost as great as Earth's. Balls lobbed high in the playing courts seemed to pause at their upper trajectories and could veer bewilderingly when bouncing off walls. Yaroslav never knew for certain when the troubles began, and could remember now only a slow decay of services that he did not then wonder at, a withdrawal of high spirits that seemed merely to pace the loss of his earliest unalloyed happiness. The crossing of Saturn's orbit was not greeted with the revelry that Jupiter's had seen, though nothing perhaps could have matched the magnificence of that first celebration in little Yarro's eyes. When he was 11, students began sharing consoles. By then the older ones were saying that things were not going well with the life maintenance systems, that resources must be directed toward achieving projected efficiencies. Yaroslav and his classmates did not understand why help did not come as the Centaur passed the successive outposts of human habitation, but guessed it had to do with their general confusion as to whether the manning and dispatch of the Centaur to Neptune was an honor for its company or a banishment. By the time he was 15, Yaroslav's education was entirely directed by teachers, personnel reassigned in a desperate expedient to save the generation growing to adulthood on board from skilled barbarism. Most of Yaroslav's days were spent vacuuming algae off the surface of knee-deep ponds where it was growing too thickly and spraying it into fresh flats. Like his peers, he had a good practical knowledge of the workings of the Centaur, his world, but knew nothing he had not seen. Indeed, seen, thumped, and worked upon. He worked well, for survival now demanded it. "I tell you, Yarrow," said Clarice, who was assigned to teach physics because her students suspected she had not worked well enough in the ceramics plant, "there has never been a generation in the history of space who has had to grow up more quickly and knows less about the universe beyond their hull. You are almost frighteningly unworldly, and emotionally you are hypertrophied where you aren't stunted. If I could show you the books, if they had just been printed out." And so on. Yaroslav resented the implication that he could somehow not read. He read operating manuals very properly, as though his life or limbs depended on it, and cared nothing for a civilization he could not remember. Those 3 or 4 years older were getting screen time and training to be physicians or planetary chemists. They spent less time working on the life systems and, as far as Yaroslav was concerned, were less important. He grew up working, as everyone did, struggling to keep the system going until they could reach Neptune, where limitless hydrogen would guarantee energy freedom. That the voyage was taking 18 years, the Proxima probe would hardly take longer, was due to the enormous cost of accelerating the mass of the Centaur. The system had to be self-sustaining anyway, so sending a slow ship would cost only the colonists time, and nothing was cheaper than the colonists' time. When the blue-green disk grew in the view screens, Yaroslav looked upon it with expectation, truculence, and an unadmitted strain of fright. The rings and the 20 strange moons meant more to the colony than Neptune itself did, so he bent to learning something about them. Triton, he was repeatedly told, was as close to Neptune as the moon was to Earth, which meant nothing to him, and might suffer calamitous quakes as a consequence of gravitational pull. It would be mined for metals and easy methane, should the latter not prove abundant in the rings, but would probably never be inhabited. With a methane atmosphere and nitrogen seas, Triton would provide minerals that, added to the ice in the rings, would yield the elements for organic compounds. That Triton's world ocean had a tidal bulge kilometers high, was supposed to create immense complications, but Yaroslav never understood tides. For the first year, they held a Lagrange point and sought to plunder the rings, but little could be made to go right. As predicted, the proper type of hydrogen was plentiful, but isolating it proved too expensive, and using impure quantities for the fusion reactors threatened to stress them beyond their weakened tolerances. For that first winter, they burned methane, which Christabel, using one of those incomprehensible illusions favored by the Earthborn that so angered Yaroslav, ruefully likened to eating the sled dogs. Their attempts to settle Greater Neptune had awakened the interest of humanity, and the urgency of the Earthborn and older New Aleans to prevail took on the tinge of those political chauvinisms that had first led to the dispatch of the Neptune colony, and meant less than nothing to Yaroslav. He was indifferent to whatever had alienated his people from the rest of the settled worlds, for differences mean nothing when your own kind is all you know. Exertion for survival brought its own justification. When they decided to send a simple probe into Neptune's atmosphere, Yaroslav helped construct the bathyscaphe that had been chosen as the easiest and safest possible model. Base camp, one of those large chunks of ring material known as the foothills that circled Neptune inside the ring proper, was moved to a synchronous orbit and outfitted with a temporary station facility. The Diogenes, with a crew of 2, would be lowered on a skyline deep into the atmosphere of Neptune, in a quick mission to be completed during one of the predictable lulls in the planet's hellish weather. One crew member would conduct the experiments, the other would know the ship. If the first would inevitably prove a New Alean, political considerations prompted that the second number among those who grew to adulthood during the voyage, and who would become increasingly disaffected with the dominance of their earthborn elders. Yaroslav accepted his selection as his due, for he knew the rudimentary Diogenes inside and out. Unger appeared to like his younger crewmate, whose ignorance seemed to amuse him without diminishing his respect for the boy's skills. He attempted to explain the various experiments they would conduct and the peculiar dynamics of Neptune's weather, but Yaroslav grew resentful at the repeated reminder of events and forces beyond the Diogenes shell. Unger, in turn, was often irritated by Yaroslav's habit of referring to all the ship's elders, including the majority who had spent their lives in New Alea or smaller habitats, as Earthborn. Yaroslav considered telling him that his last teacher had reported ample precedent for such linguistic conflation, but forbore because he liked the older man. Besides, the vaunted expert had never been on a planet either. When base camp attained the low, fast orbit that paced Neptune's rotation, the Diogenes was dropped from the skyline's spinneret as a spider might descend from a branch. Gravity increased by degrees, and Yaroslav ran systems checks while Unger watched his instruments, each merely glancing, though for different reasons, at the first wisps of blue translucence visible in the ship's single porthole. After 16 hours, Yaroslav had retired to his bunk, to be thrown to the floor, where, in confusion and pain, he imagined himself still to be, pinned by weakness and full surface gravity to a bulkhead that impressed itself as hard and bewilderingly uneven as it grew steadily colder. Yaroslav moved his head to evade the formless anxiety that pushed against his stupor, and was rewarded with a bolt of pain through his face. He froze, then lifted his arms cautiously, encountering drag and a constellation of smaller pains. He opened his eyes. Blackness receded, and radial lines of light emerged broken by his suspended hands, which he refrained from touching to his nose. The stillness beneath him differed from the imperceptible sway of the last 20 hours, and Yaroslav rose painfully to a crouch, impelled finally to motion without knowing why. The open hatch was now near the tank's lowest point, and Yaroslav feared suddenly that he would lose his footing and fall through. He peeled one of the lighting strips from the tank wall and wound it around his forearm. Carefully, he lowered himself into the specimen bay and thence to the life module, shadows sweeping about him with his every move. The life module was colder now, and Yaroslav's panting billowed visibly before him. He pulled on his pressure suit and immediately felt warmer, although its weight hung upon him like chains. The suit would conserve his body heat against any temperature the life module might soon reach, though this would not hold where Yaroslav had to go. Moving clumsily about the control room, Yaroslav found his helmet and fastened it on. The system's lights winked on within, showing suit power seriously depleted from the short circuit Yaroslav had used to produce the power surge. He nodded, unsurprised. The light strip, which Yaroslav had transferred to the pressure suit, did not adhere well, and Yaroslav knotted it like a tourniquet. Slowly he began opening the floor hatch to the airlock, laboriously removing the floor panels and underlying bolts. As Yaroslav began loosening the final bolt, the hatchway blew inward, releasing a jet of blue-white gas into the room. The spray that struck Yaroslav's arm felt immediately cool through the suit, and frost clouded his faceplate. The air was filled with an ammoniac blue that deepened as the pressure increased. By the time the gusts abated and an even coolness swirled about him, Yaroslav could see nothing but a submarine glow around his knotted arm. He had suspected that the airlock may have been breached, but was stunned by the pressure differential. Clearly, no airlock remained. Yaroslav looked around the drowned room, which trembled faintly with the pings of contracting metal. There was no turning back now. Feeling about the floor, Yaroslav found the hatch and climbed down the rope ladder, which ended in tatters after 5 rungs. Reluctantly, he activated the high beam on his helmet and peered about. Unger had told him that the surface of Neptune would resemble the bottom of the sea, which possibly it did. Beyond the slender beam of his headlight, that color closest to the black closed in rapidly, brightening to a deep mauve only when he looked up past the ship. The Diogenes was resting at an angle upon an uneven surface whose features the beam could not reach. Most of the ship's undercarriage was missing. Yaroslav could see dangling metal where the main engines and fuel tanks had been. He killed the beam after a single sweep and descended hand over hand to the bottom rung, from which he could feel his toes brush the ground. Whatever else, he thought, straightening from his brief drop to look about the chill and turbid landscape, I am the first human to stand upon Neptune. The sensation could not have been stranger had he been standing on Earth. His soles crunching underfoot, Yaroslav walked carefully around the wreck of the Diogenes. The remaining structure of the ship comprised the disk of the life module, surmounted by the lobed specimen bay, the spherical main sample tank ringed by 4 smaller tanks. The 5 shells were in turn encased in a metal dome, which had been designed to equalize wind flow over the ship's surface lest the Diogenes twirl like a pendant. Although Yaroslav could not see it, he knew that the skyline ran straight up from the dome into space, still under tension after the ship had come to rest. Yaroslav had no delusions that the Diogenes could be hoisted to safety. He remembered now that the skyline could bear little stress, having simply allowed the Diogenes, buoyed by its empty tanks to a manageable weight, to descend through the atmosphere without need for braking jets. Even now, with the massive undercarriage gone and the sample tanks still light with earth-pressure air, the Diogenes would not rise a meter without its shattered rockets. As Yaroslav stood before the hulk, a faint pull began to draw on him from one side, which he took several confused seconds to realize was a wind. towing steadily in the dense atmosphere. The realization prompted a sudden recollection, something Unger had said about the need to get aloft before the weather changed. He could not remember the details. Yaroslav strode forward, realizing with a start that his soles had begun to go numb, and began feeling along the hull of the Diogenes. The ship's exterior was studded with handholds, and Yaroslav quickly found a rung and attempted to pull himself up. Contusions shouted across his body, an insurrection of injured muscles. Yaroslav swayed, almost sickened by the pain, but held, and after several seconds pulled both feet clear of the ground. The frozen surface would drain away heat faster than boot contact with hull or air, and Yaroslav could not afford to turn up his suit. Yaroslav could not discern the direction of the wind, but knew he had to get into its lee. Wind chill was a mystery to him, but he understood how moving water could rob an object of heat. 5 rungs up, a foot ledge encircled one tank, and Yaroslav began to edge along it, new muscles protesting at the exertion. When the elephantine nudge of breeze seemed to abate, he paused, clinging to the hull like a winter fly, and tried to think. Yaroslav knew his only hope lay in jettisoning enough mass from the Diogenes to float the empty tanks, which might conceivably rise high enough to allow base camp to reel him in. He could think of no way to achieve this, and more disturbingly, neither evidently could base camp, which had computer projections and the ship's designers to call on. The flooded compartments of the life module could not be blown, nor the sample tanks cut free. Stabilizing thrusters were mounted on the hull, but their electrical systems were decapitated, their fuel tanks gone. Yaroslav mentally traced their fuel feeds and cables down longitude lines to the undercarriage, and abruptly he had something. A fuel line ran the circumference of the Diogenes along the underside of the ledge Yaroslav stood on. It served as a backup route so that propellant could still reach all 4 thrusters if a direct line was broken. The lines had stop valves at every meter so that a rupture would not drain the fuel tanks. Consequently, the 4 severed feeds and connecting loop still held high-grade fuel. Yaroslav entered the fuel line's diameter and estimated lengths in the suit computer, although the displayed result, about 14 liters, told him little in terms of effectiveness. He began to sidle painfully along the ledge, reaching a thruster only after coming back into the wind, which now seemed stronger. Yaroslav hooked one elbow through a strut and turned his headlight on low. The thruster's casing was compatible with suit tools, and Yaroslav opened the panel without difficulty. The solid-state circuitry within was not amenable to impromptu rewiring, as the power cables inside had been. But what Yaroslav wanted to do would not require finesse. It would probably get him killed, but base camp would sense it with their infrareds and know what he had tried. The auxiliary propulsion system was monopropellant, which fit Yaroslav's plans. And the fuel, a high-energy borohydride, was under pressure, if not as great as the surface atmospheres. Yaroslav uncoupled 2 lengths of fine cable from around his waist and clipped them into place within the circuitry. Playing out the line before him, Yaroslav backed slowly around the dome's circumference until he found the service hatch in the specimen bay. Atmospheric pressure posed no impediment to pulling it open. As Yaroslav expected, the specimen bay was now filled with methane. He crawled into the darkness within. It was still inside, but probably no warmer. Yaroslav hoped that the stresses of the temperature drop had weakened the struts supporting the tanks. The skyline, he knew, was anchored not to the dome, but to the main tank beneath it. That, too, suited his purpose. Moving about the lobes by the dim effulgence of his lighting strip, Yaroslav felt momentarily protected, the lone individual in a vaulted, insular universe. He shook off the thought with an effort. The anesthetic quality of adrenaline was another trap. Yaroslav detached the trailing wires from his suit and began to climb the rungs of the nearest tank. He was immediately assaulted by fatigue and swayed from the rungs as black spots erupted before his eyes, wondering stuporously what the surface gravity was. He ascended 3 steps very slowly, then clipped a lifeline to one rung, fearful that a fall of 2 meters would kill him. When he reached the point where the swell of the main tank touched the side he clung to, Yaroslav studied the connecting strut, which had been welded and could not be unfastened. He banged on it several times with his spanner until sudden exhaustion made him swoon, and he crawled shakily back down. On the bay deck, the temptation to lie down came over him so strongly he had to grip a rung with both hands. The second tank was dealt with in the same way, although Yaroslav realized upon regaining the deck that he had no idea how long it had taken. He was moving cautiously toward the third, fanatically concerned that he not reverse his steps and reascend the first, when the deck lurched slightly beneath his feet. Yaroslav's care in taking his steps told him at once that the deck level had altered, and the Diogenes was settling into Neptune's frozen crust. Quickly, legs trembling, Yaroslav made his way to the hatch of the main tank, which he confirmed was sealed tight. On the deck beneath the hatch he picked up the voice recorder, which he realized must have slid through the hatchway. Yaroslav snapped it to his belt and returned to the twin cables, which he attached to the power pack of his suit. Looking about the darkened bay for the point of greatest shelter, Yaroslav retreated to the narrowest space beneath the underside of the main tank and wedged himself into it. He clipped his lifeline to a handhold, checked the leads of the cables, closed his eyes, and depressed a switch. The concussion seemed to strike him from all sides, an imploding front that knocked him out of his body. Yaroslav thought he tasted blood, but heard and felt nothing, or rather could assimilate no sensation but that within his mouth, while the rest raged elsewhere, uncomprehended. He thought nothing, but was suffused with awareness of self, a sufficiency that precluded urgency or impulse in any direction. How long this lasted, Yaroslav could not tell, but the tugging he at length grew aware of had had some part in the plenum of his being long before attention found its focus. Pain still found no place, but saliences of feeling dimpled his consciousness, and without wondering at it, Yaroslav distantly knew that what he felt was acceleration, gentle but distinct. When at last he opened his eyes, he was already feeling a cool wash, picked with premonitions of sharper sensation, and Yaroslav turned his neck painfully to see around him a field of deep color. The main tank of the Diogenes had burst the ruptured bounds of the ship like a bubble, and was rising. Exhilaration gave way within seconds to panic, and a sudden terror with the realization that he was dangling from the lifeline hooked to his belt. Yaroslav's senses told him that he was turning slowly, and he froze. With an effort, he arched his back, and as he felt his head rise higher than his waist, Yaroslav groped about the darkness above him. His fingers brushed smoothness, and after several seconds closed around a handhold. With the exertion of frenzy, Yaroslav pulled himself up against the tank and thrust both forearms through the rungs. He used a second lifeline to lash himself against the surface, and, securely fast, was able to consider his position. The air tank was rising on the ballast force of its lighter gas content, perhaps augmented by whatever heat the tank absorbed when the fuel line encircling it burst. The explosion must have gone essentially as Yaroslav envisioned, its force blown inward by Neptune's surface pressure to rupture the dome and outer tanks surrounding the central shell. If tatters of debris were clinging to the tank, he realized, its lifting power would be greatly reduced. Yaroslav activated his headlight and peered about the underside above him, but could see nothing beyond the dim curvature of metal horizon. Lift would be a problem, whether there was debris clinging or not, as Yaroslav had known without pausing to think about it. There could be no question of his makeshift balloon ascending high into Neptune's atmosphere. As with all planets, Neptune's atmosphere dissipated much faster than its gravitational strength, and the refloated Diogenes would soon reach that stratum where its lift and weight attained equilibrium. From there, the cooling of its contents would bring it assuredly down, even assuming that the skyline was exerting some pull owing to elasticity. The shell, a metal artifact, would rise only from the thickest depths. It would be far too low for rescue. Yaroslav let his head loll, since it had begun aching in its raised position. Dark shapes moved across his faceplate, and when Yaroslav activated his helmet light, he saw its interior was streaked with blood. A catalogue of his injuries would serve no purpose. He had worked through double shifts throughout adolescence by denying pain with tricks learned from military men, but he should probably know whether hemorrhaging threatened vital suit functions. Yaroslav flexed his fingers, then brought up his knees slowly. A mistake, for his vision went red with sudden agony, and he instinctively attempted to double up against his bonds. Waves roiled through his body and crashed against his helmet. Yaroslav could only hold on while they slowly subsided. He was beginning to breathe more evenly when the first blow struck the tank. Yaroslav was thrown against his bonds, thinking wildly that he could not have done himself another injury, when a second, more glancing blow produced a higher reverberation, allowing him to recognize the first. He thought with great clarity, flung through the air. A staccato burst rattled like gravel thrown against a bulkhead. Yaroslav held still, eyes straining for signs of motion in the darkness until the impacts and vibrations diminished. At his belt, Yaroslav found the voice recorder, which he brought up to touch against his helmet. Recording. 1632 hours. Rising at an indeterminate rate. Altitude unknown. I don't know how you will recover this, but listen. There are projectiles moving through the lower atmosphere. Maybe ice thrown by the weather. Does this happen on Earth? Probably what hit the ship originally. You will have to watch for it next time. Yaroslav let his head hang, wondering what to add, then saw the rivulets of blood change course and run at a new angle across his field of vision. Concentrating on his extremities, Yaroslav realized that one side was colder than the other, and that his center of gravity was shifting. The shell was rolling slightly, dragging upon the skyline at the push of quickening winds. He was wondering about this when the ship spoke. Base Camp to Droshka, we have detected ascending mass and assumed that you are on it. The voice was fuzzy, yet resonant, as though relayed through a series of poor connections. Yaroslav thought in lucid objection that no radio beam could reach his suit antenna through the bulk of the tank. And then he understood. Estimates of your lift potential are being made. We understand that you cannot reply. Base Camp was using a tight beam on the tank again, which Yaroslav could hear through contact with his helmet. The vibrations against his back were awakening aches throughout his body. Yaroslav hung free, ascending through registers of slowly brightening color. He knew there was nothing he need or could do, and awaited word from above as lethargy crept over him. Base Camp to Droshka, we are attempting to augment lift of ballast tank by heating surface with microwaves. We assume you are beneath tank and shall play beam over upper hemisphere. Do not attempt to climb tank while irradiation is in progress." Yaroslav smiled at that. The faint tug of wind pulled against him like a hammock, and he wondered if the metal shell would warm enough to keep him alive. As the hole behind him began to vibrate faintly, Yaroslav thought he could hear the whistle of wind breaking over him. If more floes were dislodged to come sailing through the darkness, he thought uneasily, there would be no means of evading them. An enormous creaking filled the space behind him, and Yaroslav cried out as the lines holding him tightened. The reborn Diogenes, swelling however faintly as it warmed, was pressing against the rigging with which Yaroslav had secured himself. Working with panicky fingers, he untwisted one clip and opened it, causing his weight to pull hard against his hooked forearms. Carefully, he freed a second line that was slowly seeking to garrote him, and his full suited weight came to rest on his limbs. His body cried out, and Yaroslav leaned his head back to touch the hole, hungry for heat that might keep his muscles from cramping. "Yarrow, this is Lampert. Your ballast balloon has been heated to its maximum point of safe distension, and no further lift can be induced at this time. We are trying to project ascension potential. You are presently at an altitude of 38 kilometers out of 80 you must reach for the rescue attempt." So those are the numbers, Yaroslav thought. He was better at meters than kilometers, but he saw the proffered ratio clearly enough. Each additional click would be harder to attain as dwindling air pressure vitiated lift. He would not get much higher than this. Something was running across Yaroslav's faceplate, but it was not blood. Nor, he realized with a start, was it on the inside. Colorless fluid streamed down his helmet as along a pane, and a deep chill spread over his shoulders. Frozen material had collected on the metal skin because of the wind, and was now melting, with whatever did not sublime dripping onto him. Yaroslav wanted to cheer. More lift, but the thermal conductivity of the liquid would freeze him. Yaroslav kicked his feet, fearful of ice forming on them. "While I'm conscious," he thought, "I'll kick." "Yaroslav, we have a weather reading. You are running with the tide, and will derive additional lift for possibly an hour. We don't think this will suffice, but your tank will have lost some gas through its seal by then, and will perhaps take additional heat. I am sorry you cannot reply." Yaroslav brought up the recorder. "Acknowledged." He did not understand most of that, but recognized the sound of good news. With weakness came a rush of feeling, and Yaroslav sought something to say. "I should tell you the surface was solid where we touched down." "Oh, you'd know that." At the first sign of irreversible descent, he would clip the recorder to a rung and let go. The shell's sudden rise would doubtless tip them off, but they would try to recover anyway. The ship burst into a glory of violet sky, with clouds like dirty fabric dropping steadily away. Stars looked upon him from all sides, twinkling against a backdrop of deep color, shockingly unlike the unwavering blackness of space. Near one limb of the tank, a single star shone too brightly to be looked at. The sun, almost visible as a disk. The curvature of Neptune was obscured by the unevenness of the cloud cover, but Yaroslav had spent his life thinking of planets as spheres, not surfaces. What worried him now was that the clouds no longer appeared to be receding as rapidly. He watched the uneven horizon for several minutes as he flexed his ankles nervously, but apparent motion was imperceptible. "Yarrow, we have been tracking you since you broke the cloud cover, and the thinner air seems to be slowing your ascent. We think you had better come up now." "What?" Yaroslav thought. The pickup is going to be more complicated than we thought, and we want you to climb the tank rungs and get to the skyline. We know this will be very taxing for you, but you cannot rise much farther, and... Oh, no. Yaroslav raised his helmet from contact with the shell, and the voice faded. He hung from the tank perhaps halfway from bottom to equator, its bulk looming over him. There was no way he could do it. Yaroslav rested his head against a rung, the point where we have to hold the beam steady just to keep you from dropping. Your hatch seal is deteriorating rapidly, and we can give it 10 minutes max it. He pulled his head away. The clouds roiled below, enormous as nothing in the Centaur had ever been. Think of it as a task, he told himself. Freeing one arm from its rung, Yaroslav found the clip of his lifeline on his belt and reached to hook it to a higher hold. He repeated the act with the second line, then began painfully to free his ankle and remaining arm from their wedged positions. Yaroslav started to shift his weight between rungs, but his stiffened grip failed almost at once, and he fell the length of his lifelines, jerked to a halt, staring downward into the clouds. It almost ended there. Yaroslav closed his eyes, swung in the brief compass of his tether as blood pattered onto his faceplate, and waited for oblivion. Instead, he slowly tilted his head below his chest, and his nose gorged with pain. Yaroslav reached behind him to grasp a line and pulled himself gradually erect. He looked up at the hovering air tank, motionless against a brighter violet than had been visible below him, and began to pull himself upward. It was never again as hard as that, not even when his foot slipped from a still-iced rung and Yaroslav slammed his kneecap against its edge. As he crossed the equator, light broke over him, indistinct in the smeared pink of his faceplate. Yaroslav tried to disregard it as he groped single-mindedly for the succeeding rungs, intent that even the harbingers of delirium not deflect him. The upper hole seemed faintly warm to his touch, but Yaroslav no longer trusted his sensations, which had left his legs entirely. The skyline rose from the hole's top as from an ornament, a featureless cable 1/2 meter across. It was, Yaroslav knew, not one molecule, but hundreds, braided and cultured like genes. As he advanced on hands and knees across the now nearly horizontal handholds, Yaroslav fixed his gaze upon it, seeing the reinforced collar that held it to the hole, its surface ringed with holds for his tether. With his feet planted on either side of it, Yaroslav encircled the skyline with his lifeline and stood slowly. Looking up into the radiance overhead, Yaroslav saw through an unclouded corner of his faceplate a gibbous disk of liquid blue. Triton was high in the sky, as close as the moon was to Earth, Yaroslav recalled, and even larger. Neptune's reach had drawn the retrograde satellite over eons to a startling proximity, which now raised tides in Neptune's ocean of atmosphere. It was this, Yaroslav realized dimly, that Unger had wished to keep ahead of: moonrise and high tide, the welling of winds that had raised the Diogenes makeshift balloon a few clicks higher than it otherwise would have managed. "Yarrow!" said Lampert's voice, and it was clearer than he had heard it before, the tight beam falling directly onto his helmet. "We think we detect you on topside. You should strap yourself tight to the skyline because we're going to have to cut away the tank with a laser. It's a very risky maneuver and, well, you should keep your hands in as close as possible. I don't like the margins for error we have to accept. We're going to start a countdown at 90 seconds because time is very tight. I wish we could hear you." "Roger," said Yaroslav, bringing out the recorder. He clipped it to the lifeline, then wrapped the second line round his waist for good measure. He could not feel to control his legs, but the freezing of the suit's blood-soaked lining would hold him upright. "You'll hear this." The sky was beginning to grow darker, though Triton continued to brighten. These contradictions did not disturb Yaroslav, who was not accustomed to cycles of daylight. He wrapped his arms round the skyline, whose cross-linked strands were not designed to absorb heat, so did not feel cold. No more wind, he thought, for the skyline rose straight up, as abstract and ideal as a vector he had ascended to grasp. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.